This is a response to Josh Strife Hayes' video on why Battle Royale shooter games suck. I'm going to assume that you've either watched the original video or are already familiar with concepts like gameplay loops and what they mean, so I'm not going to go over these definitions again. If you want a good explanation, watch the original video. So, let's get right into it.
Battle Royale shooters suck. They are not good games at their core. The central design elements of these games are flawed, and this leads to them all, without exception, being terrible.
So I actually agree with this conclusion. However, I don't think the arguments that are presented in this video justify it. I think the arguments, they really don't show why Battle Royale games are bad. I do, however, have some different arguments that I think work a lot better to prove this conclusion.
The most famous of these games are Fortnite, Apex Legends, PUBG, which stands for PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, and Escape from Tarkov. But there are many more games and genres which have been infested with the Battle Royale curse, including, for some reason, Tetris.
Okay, Tetris Battle Royale is actually pretty cool.
Battle Royale is a game mode, not a mechanic. A mode is a way the game will operate with several smaller mechanics all adding up together. Change one of those mechanics, and you have a similar but different mode. I'll explain this more later. A Battle Royale game mode usually refers to any game where a large amount of players each choose to play as a specific avatar with specific abilities, are placed into one shared arena, and must then fight against each other. When you are defeated, you are removed from the game.
And this is where my problems with this video start. So I think this definition is good for some Battle Royales, but it certainly doesn't include every single game that is usually thought of as a Battle Royale. For example, we get to something like PUBG. It's quite obviously a Battle Royale shooter, right? It has all the standard mechanics that you'd expect. You know, you start out in an arena with multiple players, and the last man standing wins. I think we can all agree that that's a fairly standard Battle Royale. However, that doesn't really have the concept of choosing a character the same way that other games do. And I think that's part of the reason why I think some of these arguments don't work, is that arguing against hero Battle Royales or hero shooters, right? That's different from just arguing against shooters in general, because some of those mechanics are going to be very different. And if you're going to argue against hero shooters specifically, then those arguments don't apply to the rest of the games that would be classified under the Battle Royale genre.
That doesn't stop them from sucking, though. And here's why. Poor gameplay loops and excessive downtime.
So I agree with this argument, actually. I do think that one of the biggest problems with Battle Royales is that you spend so much time running around and trying to get loot and just trying to essentially move from a place to a different place. And the actual shooting part of the game, you know, which is usually the part that players consider more interesting, that part doesn't really have much time that you as a player spend on that. You might have a few shootouts in a game, for example, but those last several seconds maybe, and then eventually one of them, you either win the game or one of those shootouts ends up with you losing. And then that's it. So all that time you spent gathering resources and just moving around the map, not really doing much, essentially is just over because of a few seconds of gameplay that actually matters. And I think that's where the problem with Battle Royale shooters specifically is.
All video games are made up of what we call gameplay loops. What do you actually do in the game and for how long? These are the various mechanics that build together to create the specific game mode you are playing. The simple example is PONG. The gameplay loop is to move a paddle to hit a ball. Space Invaders is moving a ship to shoot enemies while avoiding fire. These examples are super simple. But as you move into more complex games, the complexity of each gameplay loop doesn't change, you just gain more loops. The Witcher 3 is a huge game, but each loop is relatively simple. talk to a person, and then go to a place, is the majority of the questing. Combat is hit the enemy and avoid being hit. Upgrading is find items to make new items. A complex game indeed, but with many simple gameplay loops. With that in mind, let's examine the details of the core gameplay loops of common Battle Royale games. Before the game starts, you'll usually be able to pick a specific character and customize how they look, sometimes to a lesser extent, how they play. The fashion within these games is purely cosmetic, so has absolutely no effect on gameplay at all. However, it's often a major sink of development time.
Yes, it's true that a lot of development time goes into developing cosmetics, at least according to my understanding. However, you have to realize that these games do have to make money somehow. Many of them are free to play, and so cosmetics are probably one of the best ways of monetizing that, because you don't really want to lock content behind paywalls. That would leave players feeling frustrated, right? And I won't go into a whole deep discussion of the problems and the advantages of using cosmetics for monetization. However, I think it's fair to say that that's a fairly common practice.
You can choose which colour your gun is, which visual appearance you want to have, what your victory dance will be if you defeat an enemy. And while this entire system seems deep, it's completely superficial. How you look will not affect gameplay at all. It's a cosmetic vanity choice. So the first choice we make in this gameplay loop is purely cosmetic.
Right, so the cosmetics don't affect the gameplay at all. So because of that, I don't really think that's part of the gameplay loops that are, part of the game. Just because it's not really a loop that you do. It's just something that you set up before a game and then essentially forget once the game actually starts. So I don't think it's really fair to put this into the category of the gameplay loops that Battle Royales have. And, you can't really criticize it for being boring because it's not part of the game itself.
Before the game begins, you're then tasked with picking a character or a loadout, a selection of abilities or skills you'll take into battle which will define your playstyle and the specific choices you'll need to make to achieve victory. This choice usually gets games referred to as hero shooters, as you're controlling a heroic character, not simply a blank avatar. The second choice is therefore a tactical character choice.
Yes, it's true that in many games you do have to choose a character or class beforehand. However, that's definitely not true for all Battle Royales. And so I think any criticism that you can make about this isn't really a criticism of Battle Royales, but is a criticism of hero shooters in general. Even games that aren't Battle Royales, like Overwatch, which is the quintessential hero shooter. You can make criticisms against those, but that's separate from the criticisms about Battle Royales. And so that's why I don't think they really have much to do with why Battle Royales specifically are bad.
Character selection. The hero shooter gameplay choice means players will be different from each other because they'll have different abilities. Some may have a higher jump, do more damage with certain guns, or have passive abilities which affect your healing. The downside of a hero shooter is playing as a character with different abilities from the person you're fighting means you're never actually comparing two players. You're comparing two players using two heroes. There's another layer of gameplay mechanic between them, so skill versus skill is always slightly skewed.
Yes, so matchups between players with different characters are going to be slightly skewed, just due to the nature of the characters being different. However, they're also going to be skewed by things like positioning, right? Both players in an encounter start at different locations. One might be slightly more advantageous than the other. There might be some other factors, right? Just the quality of your teammates. The point is that just because there is this asymmetry between characters, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no competitive balance between them.
Sports involving various athletes competing don't allow them to take the sport on in slightly different ways. They don't allow variation within the actual gameplay. Tennis doesn't let you choose between a racket or 2 sticks. One side of rugby can't choose to play twice as many players, but they have to tie their shoelaces together and jump everywhere. Variation at the character stage means balancing issues for the developers. It means overpowered or underused abilities for certain heroes. It means another level of variation in a gameplay loop that's not actually about variation. It's about killing the other players, and the fairer that can be, the better.
I think that comparison to sports is actually quite interesting, because it ignores some of the esports that exist with the similar mechanic of having different characters, and yet they still remain very competitively viable games. Consider, for example, MOBAs, which are probably the most popular esports genre. Games like Dota, League of Legends, Heroes of the Storm. All of those games have players choosing different characters, and despite this, they remain relatively well balanced and are very popular and generally thought of as being good competitive games. Even consider games like Overwatch. The games are inherently asymmetric, with both an attacking team and a defending team, for example, on certain maps, and also the variation in the characters themselves. However, again, that doesn't necessarily make a game not competitively viable. If you want to take an even more extreme example, consider games like Counter-Strike. You have one team that's defending and another team that's attacking. Between the terrorists and counter-terrorists, some items are cheaper and some are more expensive. One side has access to weapons that the other side doesn't, and vice versa. There's an inherent asymmetry there, and yet CSGO is considered a fairly well-balanced competitive game. So just because some kind of asymmetry exists, that doesn't necessarily ruin competitive balance or make it unfair for one side or the other. Now granted, there certainly are cases where certain characters or abilities or items are unbalanced, as such that a player who isn't using them would be at a strong disadvantage. However, that's a matter of game balance and game development, and isn't an inherent problem.
Then the game will begin. The popular Battle Royale games of the late 2010s and early 2020s, Fortnite, Apex Legends and PUBG, have players entering the actual in-game arena from the sky, jumping and paragliding down onto the battle zone. This is a tactical choice. Your positioning on the battlefield will either help or hinder you. Land somewhere popular and you'll have other players to deal with. Land somewhere deserted and you'll be alone, but also far from any tactical position. This part of the game is actually skill-based. Knowledge of the map and of the common tactics others use will help you here. So our third choice is also tactical.
Yep, no problems there. I think that choosing your starting location in Battle Royales is a fairly well-designed mechanic. You know, is some tactics involved, but not a huge amount that would be overwhelming to players. I think it's a fine design choice.
This process of choosing where to start and then making your way through the sky serves absolutely no purpose other than providing a pseudo-dynamic feel of starting a battle. You can't fight in the air. You cannot fail at any gameplay loop at this moment of play because there aren't any happening. This is essentially a glorified loading screen before the game begins. The same thing could be achieved by having a large map displayed and giving each player 10 seconds to select where they'd like to start before teleporting them all there instantly and letting the game begin. Actually, the teleportation idea would speed up games and increase the fairness of them, as you'd all hit the ground at the same time and be unaware of who's around you from the start. The entering the arena phase is pretty, but ultimately pointless window dressing before the game actually begins. It's a tactical choice and then a needlessly long entrance cinematic played out each and every time a game begins.
Okay, I think this video misses part of the point of the way that most Battle Royale games start, which is the entering the arena by dropping in from the sky. The claim that there is no gameplay happening during the drop phase just isn't true, because not only do you have to look at the map and see where, other players are falling and therefore your enemies are falling, and make decisions based on that, but you also have to communicate with your team. Maybe one of them notices something that you don't, and so therefore you'd have to dynamically adjust your strategy in real time. So the claim that this isn't a gameplay loop just, again, isn't true. If you were to just teleport to a starting location, then yes, you're right, you wouldn't have the opportunity to react to what other players are doing. However, by dropping in real time and having the ability to adjust your trajectory, you can actually react to what other players are doing, and so that is, by definition, gameplay.
Then, when you've landed on the battlefield, you'd expect the core gameplay loop to begin, the shooting, except we have another obstacle to cross: finding a weapon. You see, games like Fortnite and Apex Legends have you enter the battlefield essentially unarmed, and you'll have to search for weapons and armour hidden throughout the game world, with guns and ammo being stored in certain locations. Unfortunately, each item is not equal, with some guns being immensely powerful and some armour providing more protection, or support items like healing packs giving a large advantage. There's no way of knowing what item will be in what location when you start, so you have to simply hope. This means our fourth choice is purely luck. That feels like it somewhat invalidates the previous two tactical choices, but let's carry on and examine that more later. Finding the weapons and armour you'll use. Once you've landed, you'll be madly searching for the guns that you can kill with and the armour you can survive with. This is a luck-based gameplay mechanic. You may find a great gun. You may find something terrible. But as there are a limited number of weapons and items available, finding something brilliant not only guarantees you have it, it guarantees somebody else won't find it. By taking an item from location A, you leave location A blank for the next unlucky person to discover it. This limitation on guns is done to increase exploration. You need to move quickly to find the good stuff, but also means after the short and intense flurry of searching for a gun within the first minute of the game, the scales are then heavily tipped in favour of those lucky few carrying around the more powerful items.
Right, so the usual criticism of Battle Royales here. It's that the weapons you find are fairly luck-based, and so your success isn't really based on your skill, but based on your luck. I do think that it's true that luck plays a fairly important factor. However, I think people overrate the importance of weapons specifically in Battle Royales. Obviously, not all weapons are created equal, and if you start finding just the absolute best gear available, then you're certainly going to be at an advantage. But I think there's a lot more variance in other factors as well, such as just positioning and getting caught out in an unlucky area, being caught out of position. Things like that, which aren't necessarily luck-based, however, the player has very little control over. And so I think focusing specifically on the loot that you find isn't really a great argument, particularly because of the amount of loot that you find. Generally, you go through a pretty large variety of weapons and gear and all sorts of items throughout the course of the round of a battle royale. And so it tends to even out in the end. Maybe you get some good gear earlier, maybe you get some later. But at the end of the day, by the time you're at, a final showdown, you're probably going to have some of the best gear available anyway. So I think it doesn't make much sense to focus on the randomness of this element in particular.
So now we've played dress up, chosen a hero, landed in the arena, and found whatever we're lucky enough to find. The core gameplay loop can now begin, the actual shooting. This is the main issue. Because of the previous luck aspect of what item you may find, the core gameplay loop is always unfair. Those players who find a better weapon will have an advantage over players who found useless items. And the core gameplay loop of kill other people is now fundamentally flawed because all players are not given an equal chance to kill the others. Some players will immediately find a large advantage through weapons or armour and immediately increase their chances of winning. This early game mechanic, being mainly luck, invalidates almost all tactical choices made previously. It does not matter which hero you are playing, what you look like, or where you landed, if you can be denied a chance at victory due to the lack of a decent gun.
Early on this can be an issue, however, as the game progresses and most players end up with very good gear, it becomes less and less of a problem, which I think is fine from a game design standpoint, because if it's an issue early on, well then the player hasn't invested as much time into the match, and if they lose in the first few minutes, well then they could just go find another game, right? It's not a huge deal. However, when a round has already lasted for 30 minutes and it's just closing in on the showdown, well then at that point, this isn't much of a problem either, because both players, or all players at that point, have pretty good gear. Over the course of the round, you have many opportunities to find loot. And so, because of that, the variance of each individual loot drop actually doesn't matter very much. Essentially, by having these many different chances, you smooth out the variance of having any individual one make or break your game. And so I think if you don't take that into account, then yes, it does seem completely luck-based, and I won't deny that luck is involved. However, if you consider the fact that there are many loot locations and many chances to get items, that luck isn't as important as you might think.
Then comes a major fork in the road, based on whether you succeed or fail the gameplay loop. If you succeed and kill another player, you will continue playing. If you fail, you will be removed from the game. Succeeding at the loop is great. You're allowed to continue playing until you're the last one remaining and win. However, failing at the loop results in immediate removal from the game and you are returned to the lobby. This is the place you wait for another game to begin. Some games do have revival mechanics where you can be returned to life by a caring teammate reaching you, but the main gameplay loop is death equals removal. So now we come to the only gameplay loop you're actually able to succeed or fail, killing another player or being killed. This is the main part of the game players talk about and recognise, the Battle Royale itself. Players killing players and surviving against all odds. You are able to kill another player by shooting them, punching them, grenading them, reducing their health to 0 in any way possible. However, it is highly likely you will be killed by another player you have never even seen. Combat in these games favours stealth attacks. The element of surprise is the most overpowered tactic. While the image of two equal combatants facing each other, like the Wild West standoffs of Hollywood, is a sexy ideal, it's not the reality of these games. You'll be shot by a sniper from impossible distance, hit by a grenade thrown with blind hope, run into a shotgun coming round a corner.
The time you spend in each individual round, only a very small amount of it actually matters, which is the encounters with other players. And so, I think that's the fundamental problem with Battle Royales, is that huge imbalance between the amount of time you spent actually facing off with other players versus the amount of time you spent looting. And I think that's what makes Battle Royales poorly designed.
Your death, the end of your gameplay loop, is most likely to be brought about by no fault of your own. And that is one of my largest issues with these games. Battle Royale games focus on the gameplay loop of player versus player, and end the loop when you get killed. But the vast majority of deaths will not be because you made a mistake. They will happen because the map is so large, the number of players so many, and the luck of the initial search for the items so random that you have no way of preventing your death. Your gameplay loop will end abruptly because of factors totally beyond your control.
Most of those factors actually are in your control, and the ones that aren't don't affect the results of facing off another player as much as you might think. Despite that, I think it's still problematic how much time you spend looting versus how much time you spend actually using that loot.
If you manage to survive, you'll eventually be crowned the victor. You will achieve that coveted victory royale. The only way to win is to cause everyone else to lose and leave the game. Your victory requires the failure of other players. Your enjoyment requires their disappointment. This means with a 100-player start, only 1% of players will enjoy that feeling of elation and victory. Any game with a 1% enjoyment ratio would generally be considered bad, but that feeling of I am the 1% when you do win is enhanced here, and I do understand why they have chosen to include it. That's the first of two reasons of why I dislike these games. A pointless cosmetic loop, two tactical loops invalidated by a purely luck-based loop, and then that likely ending of the core gameplay loop by unseen forces.
An aspect of Battle Royales that isn't mentioned in this video that I think does make Battle Royales unfun is just how much snowballing plays an effect on your success. By snowballing, I mean that if a player is already doing well, it's much more likely that they're going to continue to do even better. Why is that? Well, because the best loot source is other players that you kill. So if you manage to kill other players, it's likely that you already had some kind of advantage. And so by getting the person's loot that you just killed, then that makes you even stronger. And so in that way, a player that's doing well is only going to do better, which just makes it hard for everyone else to catch up. It's not a bad idea to provide incentives for players to actually kill each other and play the game in a fun, aggressive way, rather than just camping somewhere. However, the death zone or cloud or whatever other mechanic prevents players from just sitting in one spot for the whole game already does that job. So I don't think it's necessary to have an additional mechanic that makes the game less fun to enforce the same gameplay style.
My next main issue is the actual length of enjoyable gameplay compared to the downtime of preparation. Battle Royale games all suffer from long preparation times and short enjoyable game times. You'll spend a much larger prep time in these games compared to many others. You'll be waiting for games to start, entering the battlefield, hunting for a weapon, and then enjoying a small amount of actual gameplay content before being forced back to the beginning of this boring loop.
Ultimately, that's why Battle Royale shooters suck. You spend too much time looting and not enough time shooting. Also, if you're behind, it's very hard to catch up. So players end up spending a large amount of time fighting a losing battle that they have very little chance of winning. There's no need to bring character customization or hero classes or even the luck of items that you find into it. The answer is quite simple, I think.